At the beginning of winter in 1898, 32-year-old Eliza Norwood had been cast out of her livelihood by the new owners of the timber concern, who claimed a widow had no place managing accounts or supplies, and after selling nearly everything she owned, she carried only $4 in worn silver coins before spending every last cent on a forgotten icehouse standing at the edge of Black Alder Hollow, a purchase the whole town mocked as the final proof that hardship had clouded her judgment, because the squat stone building had long ago been abandoned to weeds, silence, and drifting snow. Yet beneath its frozen floor something had remained sealed away through decades of relentless winters, waiting not merely to alter one woman's fate, but to restore truths that an entire valley had unknowingly buried beneath pride, fear, and convenient memory. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eliza Norwood. If you're listening from a place that sometimes feels forgotten by the world, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, because every quiet place carries stories waiting to be remembered. Long before hardship found her doorstep, Eliza Norwood had been known throughout Black Alder Hollow as the sort of woman who noticed details others stepped over without a second glance. She had been born during a spring thaw, when the river burst its banks and left the valley wrapped in fertile silt that promised a generous harvest. Her father, Abram Norwood, was a cooper whose barrels carried flour, apples, salted pork, and lamp oil across 3 counties. Her mother, Miriam, kept careful journals of every household expense, every favor exchanged with neighbors, and every family that needed help through lean months. Neither parent possessed wealth worth boasting about, yet together they possessed something rarer than comfort. They possessed steadiness. From the time Eliza could hold a pencil, her mother taught her that every figure written on paper represented more than money. A ledger was not simply columns of numbers. It was the record of promises kept, trust earned, and lives connected. Every unpaid debt told a story. Every receipt carried a memory. Every signature meant someone had placed faith in another soul. Meanwhile, her father taught lessons with wood instead of ink. He would place rough staves before her and ask what she saw. She would answer honestly. Crooked pieces, splintered edges, knots, imperfections. He would smile and begin shaping them with patient hands until every flawed board curved into part of something strong enough to carry grain across rivers. The world, Abram often said while shaving thin ribbons from oak, throws away things before asking what they could become. Those words settled somewhere deep inside Eliza. As seasons passed, she learned to mend cracked barrels, sharpen tools, calculate freight costs, and negotiate prices with traveling merchants, who were often surprised to discover the quiet young woman understood arithmetic better than many businessmen twice her age. She also learned another lesson, that no schoolmaster ever placed inside a textbook. People rarely feared ignorance, they feared honesty. Whenever disagreements arose over boundaries, wages, or supplies, Eliza possessed an unusual habit of searching old records before accepting loud opinions. She believed memories faded, but ink remained faithful. Older townsfolk sometimes laughed gently at her seriousness. "You'll bury yourself beneath papers one day," they joked. She would simply smile. "If papers tell the truth," she answered, "they're lighter than carrying misunderstandings." Black Alder Hollow itself seemed suspended between wilderness and civilization. Dense pine forests climbed surrounding hills. The lumber mill breathed clouds of fragrant sawdust into crisp morning air. Horse carts groaned along muddy streets. Church bells echoed through mist every Sunday. Children raced beside the creek during warmer months, while winters wrapped every rooftop beneath blankets of white so deep the entire valley appeared carved from marble. On the northern edge of town stood an old commercial icehouse built nearly 40 years earlier by the settlement's founders. Each winter, blocks of river ice had once been cut with enormous saws before being hauled inside the thick stone walls, layered beneath fragrant sawdust, and preserved throughout summer to keep meat fresh, medicines usable, and travelers supplied. But the railroad eventually connected larger cities. Mechanical refrigeration slowly appeared in prosperous towns. Business shifted elsewhere. The old icehouse emptied. Its heavy doors remained shut. Children invented ghost stories about strange sounds echoing beneath its floor. Adults dismissed the building entirely. Nature reclaimed its surroundings. Only the oldest residents remembered when wagons lined the road waiting for precious ice. To everyone else, it became another forgotten relic. Years later, Eliza married Samuel Norwood, a surveyor whose quiet kindness complemented her thoughtful nature. Samuel believed maps deserved as much respect as ledgers. A map, he liked saying while unrolling parchment across their kitchen table, shows where people wish to go. And accounts? They show where people have been. Together they lived modestly but peacefully. Samuel surveyed timberlands. Eliza gradually became indispensable inside the offices of the Hollow Ridge Timber Company. Though officially hired only as a clerk, she corrected payroll mistakes, organized shipping schedules, balanced contracts, and quietly prevented costly disputes before they reached the owner's desk. Many laborers trusted her more readily than they trusted management itself, because she never exaggerated, never promised what she could not deliver, and never ignored someone simply because they lacked influence. When injuries occurred, she made certain wages reached waiting families. When storms delayed shipments, she found practical solutions instead of excuses. She carried herself with dignity rather than authority, and somehow that earned deeper respect. Life might have continued that way for many years had illness not crossed Samuel's path during a surveying expedition in the marshlands east of Hollow Creek. It began with fever, then weakness, then long nights where every breath sounded heavier than the one before. Doctors traveled slowly, medicines accomplished little. Before autumn surrendered to winter, Samuel was gone. Grief entered the little Norwood house without knocking. Silence settled over every room. His boots remained beside the doorway for weeks because Eliza could not bear moving them. His unfinished maps rested rolled upon the shelf. His compass remained inside the pocket of his coat. Neighbors brought bread. Churchwomen offered soup. Friends promised time would soften sorrow. Perhaps they meant well. But grief does not obey calendars. Instead, Eliza buried herself in work, because work required attention rather than memory. Each morning she unlocked the timber office before sunrise. She sorted invoices, balanced freight books, reviewed inventories, prepared payroll, corrected contracts. By evening she returned home exhausted enough to sleep without dreaming too much. The company prospered during those years. Everyone assumed stability would continue, yet prosperity often attracts ambitious eyes from beyond familiar horizons. One spring, investors from the distant city of Ashcroft purchased controlling interest in Hollow Ridge Timber. They arrived wearing tailored coats that never seemed touched by sawdust. Their polished boots reflected sunlight. Their wagons carried expensive trunks rather than practical tools. The new director, Victor Harrow, spoke confidently about modernization. He praised efficiency, reduced unnecessary sentiment, promised unprecedented profits. Many applauded. Few questioned what efficiency might require. At first, the changes seemed ordinary. Old suppliers disappeared. New contracts appeared. Experienced foremen retired unexpectedly. Outside accountants replaced local bookkeepers. Then Victor Harrow summoned Eliza into his office. She expected discussion about shipping records. Instead, he folded his hands neatly across the desk and regarded her with practiced politeness. "You've served faithfully. Thank you. Times are changing. They always do." "Exactly." He smiled. "The company requires a different public image." She waited. "Some clients," he continued carefully, "feel more comfortable conducting business with men." She understood before he finished speaking. He spoke of appearances, of modernization, of restructuring, of opportunities elsewhere. Not once did he mention competence, because competence had never been her weakness. When she quietly pointed toward years of balanced books and profitable seasons, Victor merely sighed. "No criticism of your work." "Then why? The board believes widows attract unfortunate impressions." The sentence lingered inside the room long after he finished speaking it. Widows attract unfortunate impressions. Not errors, not dishonesty, not poor performance. Simply unfortunate impressions. She packed her belongings into a wooden crate that afternoon. Her ink bottle, her pencils, Samuel's small brass ruler, her mother's worn ledger notebook. Nobody cheered her departure. Several workers removed their hats respectfully as she crossed the yard. Others avoided meeting her eyes because injustice often embarrasses witnesses more than victims. The dismissal spread through Black Alder Hollow before sunset. Some sympathized. Others shrugged. Change, they said. Nothing personal. But hunger has little interest in whether hardship feels personal. It merely arrives. Winter approached once more. Savings disappeared beneath taxes, heating costs, and overdue repairs. The small house Samuel had left behind could no longer be maintained. Reluctantly, Eliza sold it. Furniture followed. Then dishes. Then keepsakes she never imagined parting with. She kept only what fit inside 2 trunks. One contained clothing. The other contained Samuel's maps, her mother's ledgers, and her father's woodworking tools. Everything else found new owners. By December, she counted the remaining money upon her kitchen table. $4 silver. Nothing more. Enough perhaps for a boarding room lasting several weeks. Enough perhaps to leave town. Enough perhaps to begin somewhere strangers knew nothing about widows or unfortunate impressions. Instead, she walked beyond the northern road where snow drifted around abandoned stone walls that most residents no longer noticed. The old Icehouse stood there exactly as childhood remembered it, weathered, silent. Its roof sagged slightly beneath accumulated winters. Iron hinges glowed orange with rust. Tall grasses poked through snow where pathways had once bustled with workers. A faded notice hung crooked beside the entrance. Property auction. Minimum bid. $4. No one else had appeared. The county wished simply to remove responsibility for maintaining dangerous abandoned property. The auctioneer looked almost apologetic as Eliza approached. "You understand," he said. "There isn't much left worth having." She studied the thick limestone walls, the unusually deep foundation, the careful craftsmanship surviving beneath neglect. Then she remembered her father's voice. "The world throws away things before asking what they could become." "I understand," she answered. She placed her $4 silver into the man's weathered palm. He hesitated. "You'll have nothing left." "I already have nothing left." The deed changed hands with surprising quiet. There was no applause, no competition, only wind moving across frozen fields as ownership of the forgotten building passed to the one person willing to believe abandonment did not always mean emptiness. By late afternoon, she unlocked the swollen wooden doors for the first time in decades. Cold air breathed outward, carrying scents of ancient timber, damp stone, pine sawdust, and time itself. Dust shimmered through narrow shafts of winter light. The interior remained astonishingly intact. Massive beams stretched overhead. Stone walls trapped lingering chill despite years without stored ice. The great storage pit yawned beneath a thick timber platform, whose planks groaned softly beneath cautious footsteps. Every sound echoed longer than expected. She explored slowly, lantern raised before her, noticing old iron hooks, broken pulleys, abandoned sled runners, and shelves where tools once rested. Nothing suggested hidden fortune. Nothing hinted that anyone else had entered for many years. Still, something felt ordered, not untouched, simply paused, as though the building had been waiting rather than dying. Near the rear wall, she discovered faded chalk markings almost erased by moisture. Not numbers, not inventory tallies. A series of initials followed by dates, ending abruptly nearly 30 years earlier. She copied them carefully into her notebook. Then she noticed another curious detail. The center of the heavy timber floor remained colder than every surrounding plank. Not merely cold from winter, different, sharper, persistent. She knelt and pressed her gloved hand against the boards. Even through thick leather, she sensed the unusual chill rising from below. It was as though winter itself had refused to leave whatever rested beneath. She could not yet explain why that small difference unsettled her more than any ghost story whispered during childhood. She only knew that forgotten places rarely guarded cold so faithfully without reason. She lifted her lantern higher, watching frost sparkle across ancient wood, never imagining that beneath those silent planks lay a secret preserved so perfectly by decades of ice that the truth waiting below had survived long after every witness believed it lost forever. The following morning dawned colder than the one before. Frost covered every stone inside the old Icehouse, and the silence seemed deeper than any church sanctuary Eliza had ever entered. She returned carrying only a lantern, a pry-bar borrowed from an elderly blacksmith who asked no questions, and a small kettle of hot coffee wrapped in cloth to keep it warm. The heavy doors groaned as they opened, sending startled sparrows fluttering from the rafters. She stood still for several moments, listening. There was nothing except the faint drip of melting frost somewhere beyond the darkness and the low whisper of winter wind pressing against the thick limestone walls. She walked directly toward the strange patch beneath the timber platform where the cold seemed unnaturally alive. Kneeling again, she ran her fingers across each weathered plank until she noticed something she had overlooked the previous afternoon. 4 iron nails near the center had not rusted as heavily as the others. Someone had replaced them years after the floor had originally been built. It was such a small difference that almost no one would have noticed it. Yet Eliza had spent half her life studying records where the smallest inconsistency often uncovered the largest truth. She set the lantern beside her and carefully worked the pry bar beneath the first plank. The old wood protested with a long, aching groan before finally lifting free. A wave of icy air rushed upward so suddenly that the lantern flame flickered nearly to darkness. She paused, allowing the air to settle before removing another plank. Beneath lay tightly packed layers of ancient sawdust that had somehow remained frozen solid. The deeper she dug, the colder the air became, until her fingertips burned despite thick gloves. It seemed impossible that frost could survive so many summers, yet the remarkable insulation of the icehouse had preserved more than cold. It had preserved time itself. For nearly an hour, she slowly cleared away hardened sawdust with a small shovel until metal struck wood below. The sound echoed through the empty building like a distant church bell. She brushed away the remaining frozen dust and uncovered the corner of a cedar chest reinforced with black iron straps. The wood looked astonishingly well preserved, protected by generations of frozen air and tightly packed insulation. There was no lock upon the chest, only a rusted iron clasp frozen shut. Eliza poured a little warm water over the hinge before carefully working it loose with the pry bar. The clasp finally yielded with a sharp crack that echoed across the chamber. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside rested bundles wrapped in waxed canvas, each tied with faded blue ribbon that had somehow escaped decay. Beneath them lay leather-bound ledgers, sealed envelopes bearing unfamiliar signatures, rolled survey maps, and a brass cylinder engraved with the year 1867. There was no gold, no jewelry, no hidden fortune of silver coins. Instead, there were papers, hundreds of pages preserved as though they had been placed inside only yesterday. Many people would have sighed in disappointment. Eliza felt something entirely different. Her pulse quickened. She understood paper. She understood records. And she understood that people rarely hid ordinary documents beneath 30 years of frozen earth, unless those papers possessed extraordinary importance. She carefully lifted the first ledger into the lantern light. The leather remained supple despite its age. Across the cover, written in elegant ink, appeared the words, Black Alder Land Trust Registry. She frowned. No such registry existed in the town records. She knew, because she had worked with county documents for years. Turning the first page, she found detailed surveys of property lines stretching across the entire valley, each accompanied by signatures from settlers whose names still appeared upon streets, churches, and family gravestones. But something seemed different. The boundaries did not match the official maps hanging inside the county courthouse. Entire parcels of woodland appeared assigned to families who had never owned them according to modern records. She opened another volume. This one listed payments made toward a community development fund established shortly after the Civil War. Every lumber family in the valley had contributed money, labor, or equipment. Beside each contribution appeared a purpose: schoolhouse construction, bridge repairs, winter food stores, medical supplies, public well improvements. None of those accounts appeared in the official histories repeated every Founder's Day. According to the town's accepted story, one wealthy industrialist named Gideon Mercer had generously financed nearly every improvement that transformed Black Alder Hollow into a thriving settlement. His bronze statue stood proudly before the courthouse. Children memorized speeches praising his generosity. Streets carried his name. Yet these ledgers told another story entirely. Hundreds of ordinary families had sacrificed together. Mercer had contributed only a modest portion, while later claiming credit for nearly everything. Eliza's breathing slowed. This was no simple bookkeeping discrepancy. This was the foundation of the town's identity. Beneath the ledgers rested dozens of unopened letters, addressed to county officials, newspaper editors, ministers, and state representatives. None bore postage marks. None had ever been delivered. Their wax seals remained unbroken. Why had someone hidden them instead of sending them? She chose one addressed to Judge Elias Fenwick and carefully opened it with Samuel's old pocket knife. The handwriting belonged to a man named Thomas Ellery, once superintendent of the original Icehouse. The letter described widespread fraud involving land transfers, forged deeds, and altered public records after a courthouse fire destroyed many original documents in 1868. Ellery claimed copies of the genuine records had been hidden inside the Icehouse until honest officials could expose the corruption. He feared powerful men intended to erase the valley's true history forever. Before he could reveal the evidence publicly, he wrote that strange men had begun following him. If anything happened to him, whoever discovered the chest should deliver the records only to someone whose honesty mattered more than reputation. Eliza slowly lowered the letter. She remembered hearing old stories about Thomas Ellery. According to local legend, he had vanished while traveling through the mountains during a blizzard. No body had ever been found. Most assumed wolves or exposure had claimed him. But the letter suggested another possibility entirely. Her eyes drifted toward the brass cylinder lying at the bottom of the chest. Unscrewing the cap, she discovered tightly rolled architectural drawings protected inside. They showed the original construction plans for the Icehouse. Yet hidden among ordinary measurements was a second blueprint revealing a concealed chamber built beneath the storage pit. She compared the drawings with the floor around her. The chest had rested directly above that secret compartment. Thomas Ellery had not simply hidden evidence. He had designed the building itself to preserve it. Suddenly, the faded chalk markings on the rear wall made sense. They were not inventory codes at all. They were initials belonging to the men who helped hide the documents, each adding his mark before disappearing from the record. Some likely died believing the truth would never surface. Eliza carefully searched the remainder of the chest. Near the bottom, she discovered a cloth pouch containing dozens of small brass tokens, stamped with family names. Their purpose puzzled her until she found another notebook explaining that every contributing household received one token representing shared ownership in the valley's public improvements. The settlement had originally been founded as a cooperative community, where prosperity belonged to everyone willing to build it. The arrangement disappeared from history after the altered records elevated Gideon Mercer into the role of sole benefactor. A single false narrative had slowly replaced the sacrifices of hundreds. She sat motionless for several minutes, as snow tapped softly against the roof overhead. The cold no longer seemed threatening, it felt protective, as though the frozen earth itself had guarded these forgotten voices, until someone patient enough finally arrived. Outside, the winter sun began slipping behind distant pine ridges, casting long blue shadows across the valley. Eliza repacked every document with extraordinary care before carrying the first ledger home beneath her coat. She understood enough to know she had uncovered something capable of changing not only her own future, but the reputation of nearly every influential family in Black Alder Hollow. Such discoveries rarely remained welcome for long. Somewhere beyond the quiet streets, descendants of those who benefited from altered history still held positions of wealth and authority. They would not surrender comfortable legends without resistance. As she reached the edge of town, she glanced back toward the lonely Icehouse standing against the white hills. To everyone else, it remained an abandoned stone building purchased by a desperate widow for $4. Only she now knew that beneath its frozen floor, an entire generation had been waiting in silence, trusting that one day someone would finally remember their names. That night's sleep refused to stay with Eliza for more than a few moments at a time. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faded signatures inside the ledgers and imagined the steady hands that had written them 3 decades earlier, believing honesty would eventually outlive deception. Before dawn, she lit the oil lamp beside her small rented room and spread the documents carefully across the worn table. She compared each survey map with copies she had quietly copied years before while working for the timber company. The differences were impossible to dismiss as simple clerical errors. Entire hillsides had shifted ownership after the courthouse fire. Timber rights once shared among dozens of families had gradually become concentrated in the hands of only a few influential men. Roads had been rerouted on paper before they were ever built upon the land. Even the location of the old public grazing fields had disappeared from official records, replaced by private holdings belonging to the Mercer estate. Yet every authentic map, hidden beneath the Icehouse floor, matched perfectly with the contribution ledgers and the handwritten letters. Independent records, prepared by different people, all pointed toward the same forgotten truth. Eliza had balanced enough books in her lifetime to recognize when separate pieces of evidence fit together too precisely to be coincidence. As daylight crept through the frosted window, another realization settled heavily upon her. The fraud had not ended with Gideon Mercer. Someone had continued protecting the lie long after his death. Statues did not remain standing for 30 years, without powerful families making certain no uncomfortable questions were asked. She carefully wrapped the documents once again before returning to the icehouse. This time she carried stronger tools and several empty wooden crates. If there had been one hidden compartment, perhaps there were others. The old blueprint showed a narrow maintenance passage built into the western wall, a feature completely invisible from inside the storage chamber. Following the measurements with Samuel's brass ruler, she counted exactly 18 paces from the entrance before tapping gently against the limestone. Most stones answered with the dull sound of solid earth behind them, but one section produced a faint hollow echo. She examined the mortar more closely. Hairline cracks outlined a narrow rectangular opening nearly concealed beneath decades of dust. After almost an hour of careful work, she loosened a rusted iron latch hidden behind a projecting stone. With a low grinding sound, a section of wall slowly swung inward, revealing a cramped passage barely wide enough for one person. A rush of air smelling faintly of cedar and old paper drifted toward her. Lantern held high, she stepped inside. The passage descended only a few feet before ending in a tiny chamber lined with shelves carved directly into the limestone. There she found not more ledgers but dozens of neatly labeled wooden boxes. Each contained personal belongings left behind by the original settlers who had safeguarded the records. Pocket watches stopped at different hours, family Bibles, children's drawings folded carefully into envelopes, a silver brooch, a schoolteacher's spectacles, letters never delivered home. None possessed great monetary value, yet together they formed something priceless. They were fragments of ordinary lives, erased when official history elevated one wealthy benefactor above an entire community. Resting upon the highest shelf stood a small walnut box, unlike the others. Its polished lid bore the carved image of a pine tree surrounded by 13 stars. Inside lay a journal belonging to Thomas Ellery himself. Eliza opened it gently. The first entries described construction of the icehouse during the late 1850s, praising neighbors who volunteered countless hours despite harsh winters and scarce supplies. As the pages progressed, the tone gradually darkened. Ellery wrote of businessmen arriving from distant cities seeking control of the valley's forests. He described forged contracts slipped among legitimate papers after the courthouse fire. He named local officials bribed with timber shares and cash. Most startling of all, he explained why the evidence had been hidden instead of immediately revealed. Every honest witness willing to testify had begun disappearing. One moved away unexpectedly. Another died under suspicious circumstances while traveling. A third withdrew his accusations after threats against his family. Ellery concluded that preserving the truth mattered more than risking its complete destruction. Better to hide the evidence where time itself could guard it than allow corrupt men to burn it forever. Near the final pages, Eliza found one sentence written with unusual pressure, as though the writer sensed every remaining moment mattered. If these pages are ever found, let the one who reads them remember that history belongs not to those with monuments, but to those whose labor built them. She quietly closed the journal. Outside the hidden chamber, she suddenly heard a distant sound. Footsteps. Someone had entered the icehouse. Instinctively, she extinguished her lantern, leaving only a thin ribbon of daylight filtering through the narrow doorway. The footsteps moved cautiously across the timber floor above. Then came the scrape of wood. Someone was examining the open planks. Eliza remained perfectly still, scarcely daring to breathe. A man's voice echoed faintly through the building. "She's been digging," another answered. "I told you buying this place wasn't ordinary." The first voice belonged to Walter Briggs, the county auction clerk who had transferred ownership only 2 days earlier. The second she recognized after a moment. Amos Mercer, grandson of Gideon Mercer and current chairman of the town council. "Search everything," Amos ordered quietly. "If she found anything, we take it before anyone else hears about it." Eliza felt her pulse quicken. Until that moment, she had wondered whether her discovery threatened only old reputations. Now she understood living people already knew enough to be afraid. Through the narrow opening, she watched boots pass across the floor outside. The men searched shelves, examined old equipment, even peered into empty corners, yet neither discovered the concealed stone doorway standing only a few feet away. Eventually, one of them approached the opened pit. "Fresh sawdust," Walter muttered. "She uncovered something. Did she remove it?" "Looks that way." A long silence followed, before Amos spoke again. "Keep watching her. quietly. If she speaks to anyone before we know what she has, this becomes difficult. And the building? Leave it, she'll come back. Their footsteps slowly faded. Minutes later, the heavy doors slammed shut. Eliza waited several more minutes before relighting her lantern. Fear whispered that she should gather the evidence and leave Black Alder Hollow forever. Yet another voice, steadier and older, reminded her of her parents' lessons. Honest records existed for moments exactly like this. Truth became valuable only when someone refused to abandon it. She spent the remainder of the afternoon moving every document from the hidden chamber into sturdy crates concealed beneath loose flooring, inside a loft above the entrance, a place even determined searchers would likely overlook. She carried only Thomas Ellery's journal and a single ledger back into town. The less she possessed at any one time, the less could be taken from her. As evening settled over the valley, she stopped outside the modest home of Reverend Josiah Pembroke, an elderly minister known more for listening than speaking. He welcomed her beside a crackling stove and listened patiently as she revealed only enough to ask one question. "Reverend," she said quietly, "if someone discovered proof that an entire town had been living inside a false story, would the truth help people or only hurt them?" The old minister stirred the fire thoughtfully before answering. "Truth always hurts at first." He looked into the glowing embers. "But lies charge interest. The longer they remain, the greater the debt when payment finally comes." Eliza nodded without revealing what she had found. She thanked him and stepped back into the snowy evening, carrying those words with her. Across the square, illuminated by the pale light of the rising moon, Gideon Mercer's bronze statue stood proudly upon its granite pedestal, while children played around its base, without knowing that beneath layers of polished metal rested a story that had never truly belonged to the man whose name was carved there. Unseen from the street, Amos Mercer watched from the second-floor window of the council hall, following Eliza's slow walk home with narrowed eyes, already wondering how a widow with nothing left had suddenly become the greatest threat his family's legacy had ever faced. The days that followed unfolded with the quiet tension of a river swelling beneath winter ice. Eliza understood she could not simply walk into the courthouse carrying a handful of old papers and expect decades of accepted history to crumble. Evidence needed witnesses, and witnesses needed courage. She began where truth always seemed safest, with ordinary people. She visited the oldest residents of Black Alder Hollow, carrying copies instead of originals, asking gentle questions rather than making bold accusations. At first, many dismissed her curiosity as harmless interest in local history, but slowly forgotten memories began surfacing. Old Martha Kincaid remembered her grandfather insisting the community school had been built by every family contributing lumber one beam at a time. Isaac Bell, nearly 90 years old, recalled hearing as a child that Gideon Mercer had argued bitterly against creating a shared public grazing field, before later claiming it as his own idea. Widow Hannah Doyle uncovered a faded family letter tucked inside her Bible that thanked Thomas Ellery for protecting our rightful records until honest days return. None of these recollections alone proved anything, yet together they echoed the same forgotten melody, preserved inside the Icehouse. Every conversation strengthened Eliza's resolve, every memory stitched another piece into the torn fabric of the valley's past. Word quietly spread that the widow who had purchased the abandoned Icehouse was asking unusual questions. Some smiled kindly and wished her well. Others stopped talking when she entered the room. Merchants who once greeted her warmly now exchanged uneasy glances before serving her. More than once, she noticed the same horse tied outside buildings she happened to visit. Amos Mercer no longer bothered hiding his interest. One snowy afternoon, as Eliza stepped from the general store carrying a sack of flour, she found him waiting beside the hitching rail. His expensive overcoat stood in sharp contrast to the worn wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. He removed his gloves with deliberate calm before speaking. "You've become very interested in old stories." Eliza met his gaze steadily. "Stories shape communities. Only if people believe them. Truth doesn't require belief. Only patience." A faint smile crossed his face, though it never reached his eyes. "You're chasing ghosts, Mrs. Norwood." "Perhaps. I'd hate to see you disappoint yourself. I'd hate to see history disappoint those who trusted it." The smile vanished. For several long seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Amos stepped closer. "The town has survived peacefully for generations. Sometimes disturbing old matters creates more harm than good. Peace built on falsehood isn't peace. His expression hardened. "You should sell that old icehouse while someone is still willing to buy it. I only paid $4. I'll give you 400. She shook her head. Then 4,000. Several townspeople paused nearby, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Eliza answered softly enough that only those closest could catch it. Some things aren't measured in dollars. Amos studied her for another moment before replacing his gloves. Think carefully. He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. By sunset, rumors had already spread across the valley that Amos Mercer had offered an astonishing sum for an abandoned building everyone else considered worthless. Suddenly, people who had laughed at Eliza's purchase began wondering what might truly lie inside those old stone walls. That evening, she returned to the icehouse and climbed into the loft where the remaining crates rested, hidden beneath loose boards. She counted every ledger, every survey map, every letter, fearing someone might have entered while she was away. Nothing had been disturbed. Yet as she prepared to leave, her lantern illuminated fresh footprints in the snow outside, 2 different sets. Neither belonged to her. They circled the building before disappearing into the surrounding pines. Someone had watched without entering. She realized then that preserving the documents inside the icehouse had become too dangerous. If fire, theft, or vandalism destroyed the originals now, generations of waiting would be lost forever. Through the following week, she quietly enlisted help from the few people whose integrity she trusted completely. Reverend Pembroke safeguarded several ledgers beneath loose floorboards inside the church library. The elderly blacksmith concealed survey maps inside the hollow base of an unused forge. Widow Hannah Doyle hid Thomas Ellery's journal inside an old grain chest beneath sacks of winter potatoes. None of them possessed the full collection. Each protected only one part of the larger truth. If anyone attempted to seize the evidence, no single search would uncover everything. Eliza often smiled to herself at the thought. Thomas Ellery had trusted one hidden chamber. She trusted an entire honest community. The irony pleased her. Meanwhile, Amos Mercer grew increasingly impatient. He instructed the town newspaper to publish editorials dismissing recent rumors as fanciful tales invented to attract attention. He arranged public lectures praising his grandfather's generosity. New flowers appeared around Gideon Mercer's statue despite the deep winter cold, an almost desperate effort to reinforce the familiar story before another could replace it. Yet the more loudly officials insisted nothing was wrong, the more curious ordinary people became. Children wandered past the old icehouse hoping to glimpse mysterious visitors. Farmers paused outside the church discussing forgotten family stories. Elderly widows searched attics for old letters they had not read in decades. Black Alder Hollow had begun remembering, and memory proved impossible to command once awakened. One bitter January morning, the county judge announced a public historical hearing to settle the growing controversy once and for all. Citizens were invited to present evidence regarding the town's founding. Amos Mercer clearly expected the meeting to silence speculation forever. Instead, it offered Eliza precisely the opportunity she had been quietly preparing for. As she left the courthouse after hearing the announcement, snow drifted gently across the square. She looked toward the old icehouse standing beyond the northern road, almost invisible beneath white hills. For the first time since purchasing it, she placed her hand against its weathered stone wall, not as a desperate widow seeking shelter, but as a grateful guardian, thanking an old building for keeping faith through 30 silent years. The frozen walls answered only with quiet stillness, yet somehow, that silence felt like encouragement. If this story has touched your heart so far, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Berry Tales, and share in the comments what forgotten place in your own hometown still makes you wonder what stories it might be keeping alive. The morning of the hearing arrived beneath a sky the color of weathered steel. Snow rested lightly upon rooftops, fences, and the branches of ancient pines surrounding Black Alder Hollow, softening the town's familiar outlines while doing nothing to quiet the uneasiness that seemed to linger in every conversation. People arrived at the courthouse much earlier than usual. Farmers left chores unfinished. Mill workers requested shorter shifts. Mothers carried infants wrapped in quilts while elderly couples leaned upon polished walking sticks, all curious to witness the strange dispute that had quietly transformed an abandoned icehouse into the center of the valley's attention. Eliza arrived carrying only a worn leather satchel, no different from the one she had used during her years at the timber company. Anyone watching might have assumed it contained ordinary account books. In truth, it held only a few copies of records. The originals remained safely scattered among those she trusted. As she climbed the courthouse steps, Amos Mercer stood waiting beneath the stone portico. His expression remained courteous, but the confidence that had once defined him seemed thinner now, stretched tightly across growing uncertainty. "There's still time to reconsider," he said. Eliza paused. "Reconsider what?" "Dragging old wounds into daylight. Old wounds heal only after they're cleaned. Some people don't want their grandparents remembered as fools. I don't intend to remember them as fools. Then what?" She looked toward the crowd slowly gathering outside. "As builders." Without waiting for his reply, she entered the courthouse. The hearing chamber filled until every bench stood occupied and late arrivals lined the walls. Judge Nathaniel Cross, whose white beard reached nearly to the top button of his coat, called the gathering to order with measured calm. "We are assembled," he announced, "to examine questions recently raised concerning the early history of Black Alder Hollow. We will hear evidence rather than rumor, documents rather than speculation, and testimony rather than accusation." Amos Mercer spoke first. He presented polished speeches praising his grandfather's generosity, reading familiar newspaper articles, dedication plaques, and ceremonial proclamations, repeated for decades. Every document originated years after the courthouse fire. Everyone celebrated Gideon Mercer as the valley's single benefactor. Many nodded along, having heard the same story since childhood. When Amos finished, Judge Cross turned toward Eliza. "Mrs. Norwood, you may proceed." She stood quietly before the assembled townspeople, allowing the silence to settle before speaking. "I did not come here to disgrace anyone." Her voice carried steadily through the room. "Nor did I come seeking wealth, revenge, or recognition. I came because forgotten people trusted that someone would eventually tell the truth they could not." She carefully unfolded the first survey map upon the large oak table. "This is an original land registry prepared before the courthouse fire of 1868. Murmurs spread immediately through the room. Several elderly residents leaned forward. The judge adjusted his spectacles. Amos frowned. "Where did you obtain that?" "From a place where cold preserved more than ice." Without waiting for interruption, she placed beside it the current county survey. The differences appeared obvious even to those unfamiliar with maps. Property lines shifted. Roads moved. Entire parcels changed ownership. She continued laying out documents one after another. Contribution ledgers listing hundreds of local families. Construction accounts showing shared labor on schools, bridges, wells, and public buildings. Receipts signed decades before the official records began. Thomas Ellery's carefully written journal. Letters sealed and dated before the alterations appeared in public archives. Every piece reinforced the others. None contradicted another. Judge Cross slowly turned each page with remarkable care. The room had become so quiet that pages sliding across polished wood sounded louder than footsteps. Finally, the judge looked toward Amos Mercer. "Can you explain these inconsistencies?" Amos hesitated only briefly before answering. "Anyone could fabricate old documents." Eliza calmly reached into her satchel and produced a small brass token bearing the Kincaid family name. "Can someone fabricate oxidation that develops naturally over 30 years beneath frozen earth?" She placed beside it several more tokens recovered from the Icehouse. Widow Hannah Doyle rose unexpectedly from the audience. "My grandfather carried one exactly like that until the day he died." Another elderly man stood. "So did mine." A third voice followed from the back of the room. "My mother always wondered why her father kept speaking about a community trust no one else remembered." One after another, forgotten memories emerged. Family stories dismissed for generations suddenly found confirmation within the preserved records. Judge Cross requested each witness come forward individually. By afternoon, the hearing had transformed from a dispute into a remarkable reconstruction of forgotten history. Even people who arrived expecting to defend the accepted version now struggled to ignore the overwhelming consistency of the evidence. Then, Reverend Pembroke quietly approached, carrying another ledger previously hidden beneath the church floor. Behind him came the blacksmith with survey maps. Widow Hannah Doyle followed carrying Thomas Ellery's journal wrapped in linen. Without planning it, the townspeople themselves demonstrated that the evidence had never rested in one person's hands alone. It belonged to the community. Amos Mercer watched the procession with growing disbelief. His confidence finally broke when Judge Cross compared Thomas Ellery's signature against authenticated records preserved by the state archives. Every flourish matched perfectly. There could be no reasonable doubt. The journal was genuine. The judge removed his spectacles and rested them carefully upon the bench. "It appears," he said quietly, "that this community has honored one generous man, while unintentionally forgetting hundreds of equally generous neighbors." No one applauded. The realization felt too solemn for celebration. Outside the courthouse, bells began ringing noon, their familiar sound drifting across snowy streets that suddenly seemed somehow different, not because the buildings had changed, but because the people looking at them finally understood whose hands had truly built them. Amos Mercer remained standing beside his table long after the hearing recessed. His shoulders seemed smaller than before. The certainty inherited through generations had dissolved within a single morning. Eliza approached him before leaving the chamber. "Your grandfather still helped this town," she said gently. "These records do not erase that." He looked at her with tired eyes. "Then what do they erase?" She shook her head. "Only the loneliness of everyone who built beside him." For a long moment he said nothing. Then his gaze drifted toward the growing stack of authentic ledgers covering the judge's table. At last he lowered his head, understanding that the greatest loss was not his family's reputation, but the decades during which so many deserving names had been forgotten. Outside, snow continued falling softly over Black Alder Hollow, settling alike upon rich homes, humble cabins, church roofs, workshops, and the weathered stone walls of the old Icehouse that had quietly guarded the valley's conscience, until the day someone finally listened to what silence had been preserving all along. Judge Nathaniel Cross recessed the hearing until the following morning, so every document could be examined independently by the county recorder and compared with surviving state archives. No one objected. By then, the evidence had become too extensive for hurried conclusions. Clerks carefully carried the ledgers into a secure records room, while two deputies stood watch outside its heavy oak door. As people slowly filtered into the snowy streets, conversations sounded different than they had only hours earlier. No longer did they revolve around rumors or speculation. Instead, neighbors compared stories passed down through grandparents, each wondering whether forgotten family tales might finally possess the dignity of truth. Eliza walked quietly toward the old Icehouse, without speaking to anyone. She felt no triumph. Instead, she carried the strange weight that often follows long-hidden revelations. Restoring the truth did not erase the years that had been stolen from those who deserved recognition. It simply ensured that future generations would inherit something more honest than those before them. As she reached the weathered stone building, she paused to study its thick walls glowing softly beneath the afternoon light. The place looked no different than it had the day she spent her last $4 to buy it. Moss still clung stubbornly between the stones. Snow rested along the sagging roof. The heavy wooden doors still bore scratches left by countless winters. Yet she now understood why the building had always seemed strangely alive. It had never been abandoned. It had been entrusted with a promise. Inside, the air remained wonderfully cold. She lit her lantern and descended once more toward the hidden chamber. Although most of the documents had been removed, a careful search revealed one final object lodged behind a loose limestone block near the rear wall. It was a narrow cedar tube sealed with hardened beeswax. She carried it carefully into the lantern light before breaking the brittle seal. Inside rested a single sheet of folded parchment. Unlike the ledgers or journals, it contained no lengthy explanation. Instead, it held only 13 names written in neat script beneath a simple heading: those who refused payment. Eliza read each name slowly. They belonged to men and women who had volunteered months of labor constructing the original schoolhouse, church, bridge, and icehouse, yet had declined compensation because they believed the valley's future mattered more than personal reward. At the bottom, Thomas Ellery had written one final sentence: "Should history ever remember only one among us, let whoever finds this know that greatness is measured by those willing to remain unnamed." Eliza quietly folded the parchment. Suddenly she understood why Ellery had hidden this final page separately. Even among the preserved records, this was perhaps the most important lesson of all. The town had spent 30 years honoring one celebrated benefactor while forgetting the quiet sacrifice of ordinary neighbors who never asked for monuments. That evening she visited the cemetery, where Samuel rested beneath a simple granite marker overlooking the valley. Snow blanketed the ground in peaceful silence. She stood beside his grave for a long while without speaking. Finally, she smiled faintly. "You always trusted maps," she whispered. "I suppose this one finally led somewhere worth finding." The wind moved gently through nearby pines as though carrying the words across the hillside. The following morning, the courthouse overflowed once again. News had spread to neighboring settlements, drawing historians, surveyors, newspaper correspondents, and state officials eager to examine the remarkable discovery. Judge Cross opened the proceedings by announcing that independent comparison with surviving state records confirmed the authenticity of the Icehouse documents. Wax seals matched known county impressions. Ink composition corresponded precisely with materials manufactured during the 1860s. Paper fibers aligned with mills operating before the courthouse fire. Most importantly, forgotten duplicate surveys, stored hundreds of miles away, verified the original property boundaries preserved beneath the frozen floor. Every test strengthened the same unavoidable conclusion. The hidden records were genuine. A profound silence settled across the courtroom before Judge Cross spoke again. "History has not been overturned today," he said slowly. "It has been completed." Those words seemed to lift an invisible burden from the room. No one could change what had happened generations earlier, but everyone present possessed the opportunity to decide how the future would remember it. The county commissioners unanimously voted to establish a historical restoration committee charged with correcting public records, preserving the recovered documents, and creating permanent recognition for every contributing family identified in the ledgers. Gideon Mercer's statue would not be destroyed. Instead, new bronze panels would be added surrounding its base, listing the names of hundreds of settlers whose shared labor truly built Black Alder Hollow. The monument would no longer honor one man alone. It would finally honor the community he had once stood above. Amos Mercer slowly rose from his seat. Every eye turned toward him. He walked to the front of the courtroom, removed the ceremonial counsel pin from his coat, and placed it quietly upon the judge's desk. "My family benefited from a story that was never entirely true," he said. "Whether we created it or merely inherited it no longer matters. What matters is ending it honestly." He turned toward Eliza. "Mrs. Norwood, I cannot repay what was taken from these families, but I can help return what should never have been forgotten." There was no applause, only respectful silence. His words carried the unmistakable sound of genuine humility. Weeks passed as spring slowly loosened winter's grip upon the valley. Craftsmen carefully restored the old ice house rather than demolishing it as once planned. The hidden chamber remained intact behind protective glass, so visitors could see where history had slept beneath frozen earth for more than 30 years. Scholars arrived from distant cities to study the remarkable preservation. School children visited each month, not merely to learn about ice storage, but to understand how easily truth could disappear when ordinary voices were ignored. The restored building became known not as Mercer's Ice House, nor Ellery's Ice House, but simply as the People's Ice House. Eliza accepted no salary for the discovery, beyond reimbursement for restoration expenses. When newspapers asked why she had refused generous rewards offered by historical societies, she answered with the same quiet conviction her parents had taught long ago. Some things become smaller the moment you put a price upon them. Instead, she accepted a modest position as the Valley's first official archivist, responsible for preserving public records so carefully that no future generation would ever again lose its history to neglect, fire, or ambition. She spent her days organizing documents, recording oral histories from elderly residents, and teaching local children that every receipt, diary, map, and family letter might one day become an important piece of someone else's story. Years later, visitors often asked guides how such an extraordinary discovery had ever been made. The answer always began the same way: not with famous men, not with wealth, not with political influence. It began with a widow who possessed only $4, an abandoned ice house everyone else ignored, and the patience to notice that one section of a frozen floor felt colder than the rest. And somehow, that simple act of paying attention accomplished what decades of power never could. It gave an entire community back its own name. The years passed gently over Black Alder Hollow, yet the lessons preserved beneath the frozen floor never faded. Children grew into parents, and parents into grandparents, each generation hearing not only the story of Eliza Norwood, but also the names of the hundreds of ordinary men and women whose quiet sacrifices had finally been restored to their rightful place. Every spring, When the first wildflowers appeared along the hillside, families gathered beside the old stone icehouse for a simple remembrance ceremony. There were no grand speeches, no displays of wealth, and no claims that one person alone had built the valley. Instead, every child was invited to read aloud a different name from the bronze memorial surrounding the courthouse square, ensuring that none would ever again disappear beneath the weight of forgotten history. Eliza never considered herself a hero. Whenever visitors thanked her for changing the town forever, she would smile softly and answer with the same gentle wisdom that had guided her since childhood. "I didn't change history," she would say. "History was always waiting. I simply listened long enough to hear it." Those words spread far beyond Black Alder Hollow, reminding people that truth often survives in the quietest places, patiently waiting for someone willing to look beneath the surface. The old icehouse remained standing through every passing season. Its thick stone walls no longer protected blocks of winter ice. Instead, they protected something far more enduring. A reminder that honesty can outlast deception, that forgotten people deserve to be remembered, and that the smallest act of courage can restore the dignity of an entire community. Travelers who stopped to visit rarely left talking about the building itself. They left talking about the widow who had spent her last $4 not realizing she was purchasing the key to an entire town's forgotten soul. And so, whenever winter settled over the valley and snow quietly covered the weathered roof once again, the people of Black Alder Hollow no longer saw an abandoned relic. They saw a promise kept across generations. They remembered that true wealth is never measured by what we keep for ourselves, but by what we preserve for those who come after us. Long after Eliza's own footsteps had faded from the snowy paths, her quiet courage continued guiding countless others toward the truth, proving that even the coldest places can protect the warmest legacies. Thank you for spending this journey with us. If Eliza Norwood's story reminded you that even the most overlooked places and people can hold extraordinary value, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments about a forgotten place, family story, or hidden piece of history that has always stayed with you. And if you enjoy slow, heartfelt frontier and Western stories filled with mystery, resilience, and hope, be sure to subscribe to Berry Tales and join us for the next unforgettable journey. Until next time, take care of one another, treasure the stories that time tries to hide, and remember that sometimes the greatest discoveries are waiting exactly where everyone else has stopped looking.